Mysteries of the ancient world continue to baffle scientists even today. There are many things that we don't know about our world before 1940, such as how did many of these famous empires fall? One of the most common reasons is the sudden attack of mysterious people who came from the sea. Yes, there was no air force or army that could have attacked them. They were literally crushed by the might of the sea. So, who were these people? What happened to them? And why hasn't anyone heard of them until now? Hi, it's me, number 10, the Shurden. The Shurden were one of the most mysterious groups of people who attacked in the Mediterranean around 1200 BC. This was during the height of the Egyptian Empire. Egypt had been ruling for centuries, but suddenly the Shurden showed up, attacked the Egyptians, and took over their empire. This must have been the scariest thing ever for the Egyptians because they'd never even seen ships like those used by the Shurden. These people sailed into the Mediterranean from West Asia on large ships made of cedar wood. These vessels were huge, measuring between 120 and 140 feet long. It would take a crew of at least 70 men to operate one of these massive boats. But what makes them so special? The reason these boats were so special was that they had never been seen before in the Mediterranean. The only other place on Earth where ships of similar size and design were used were in the open seas of Mesopotamia. The problem is, there is very little known about the Shurden. We don't know anything about their culture, their religion, and even their origin is a mystery. All we really know is that they showed up out of nowhere and destroyed the Egyptian Empire before disappearing again without a trace. Number 9, the Luca. The Luca are another group of mysterious seafarers who attacked various nations along the Mediterranean coast. Back in 1450 BC, the Luca began showing up all over the eastern Mediterranean. They became notorious for pillaging villages along the coasts of Anatolia and Syria. Their attacks were sudden and brutal, and then they vanished just as quickly as they arrived. The Luca were mentioned in the writings of Egyptian pharaoh Rameses II, and he described them as a terrifying group of warriors. He said they came from the sea in ships with tall masts, which means they likely used sails. We know this because both the Egyptians and the Luca built their ships in a way that would allow them to catch the wind, making travel much easier. But just like the Shurden, the Luca also disappeared after sacking several cities. They seemingly vanished off the face of the earth, but this doesn't mean they all died. It's more likely that the Luca simply moved on to new lands, leaving the Mediterranean for greener pastures elsewhere in the world. Number 8, the Minoans. Another civilization that may have been wiped away forever by the sea are the Minoans. This mysterious group of people lived on the Greek island of Crete around 2,700 years ago. Their civilization was incredibly advanced for the time period. They built impressive palaces, developed a unique writing system, and were possibly the first people in Europe to use copper tools. Unfortunately, their civilization was abruptly ended when a volcanic eruption on the nearby Greek island of Santorini caused a tsunami. This event was recorded in Exodus as the destruction of Atlantis. It says that the gods destroyed Atlantis because its people had become too wicked. According to Plato, the whole city was swallowed by the ocean. However, there is no evidence that an entire city was swallowed by the sea. Instead, it's believed that the tsunami killed off most of the Minoan people while some others survived by fleeing to mainland Greece. The problem is, there is very little archaeological evidence that any of the Minoans ever existed. Scientists say that since they blended in with the Mycenaean civilization, there's not much left behind to prove they were ever their own society. But this is still debated among historians. Some say that the Minoans were completely wiped out by the tsunami, while others believe that they simply integrated with other civilizations and survived. Number 7, the Keftiu. The Keftiu were another mysterious people who showed up out of nowhere, attacked coastal cities, and then disappeared again. The earliest written record we have of the Keftiu comes from Egyptian records dating back to 1600 BC. The Egyptians traded with the Keftiu, which means they probably didn't live too far away. They were described as brown-skinned people who traveled in fleets of ships and were experts at navigation. In fact, the Egyptians were so impressed by the ships of the Keftiu that they tried to build their own vessels to match them. But for some reason, the Egyptians stopped trading with the Keftiu around 1200 BC. This was right around the same time that the Sheshon and the Luca invaded Egypt and set up shop along the Mediterranean. The Keftiu could have easily been wiped out by one of these invading forces, or they could have simply decided to trade with someone else. Whatever happened to the Keftiu, nobody knows. 6. The Danish. Before the Vikings were pillaging across the Mediterranean, it was the Danes. The Danes were a group of fierce warriors from northern Europe who terrorized the coastlines of the Mediterranean for centuries. The first written account of the Danes comes from the Roman historian Pliny the Younger. He wrote about the Danes in a letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan in 112 AD. He said that the Danes lived beyond the known world and that they were fierce warriors who raided the shores of Britain. At this time, the Danes weren't sailing to the Mediterranean. They stuck close to their home territory in northern Europe. It wasn't until several hundred years later that the Danes began exploring further south. By the 8th century AD, the Danes were sailing all over the North Sea, attacking coastal cities and trading in the Mediterranean. Just like the other seafaring groups mentioned in this video, the Danes would have traveled in longships. These were narrow vessels designed for speed rather than cargo capacity. Longships were propelled by both oars and sails, meaning they could travel much faster than any other ship in the Mediterranean. But the Danes didn't just use their longships for warfare, they also used them for exploration and trade. Between the 8th and 10th centuries AD, the Danes established a network of trading posts across the Mediterranean. These posts served as bases for their ships and allowed them to launch raids into the interior of enemy countries. Number 5. The Sardinia. Along with the Minoans, the Sardinians were another ancient civilization that was wiped out by a natural disaster. The Sardinians were a Bronze Age culture that lived on the Mediterranean island of Sardinia. They flourished from around 1800 to 1200 BC, which was right around the same time that the Egyptians were ruling over the Mediterranean. The Sardinians were known for their distinctive pottery, which often featured geometric designs. They also had a unique language that was unrelated to any other languages in the region, but their civilization was abruptly ended when a tsunami struck the island. This event was recorded in Egyptian sources, but we don't know exactly what caused the tsunami. It may have been caused by an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, but whatever the cause, the tsunami destroyed the Sardinian civilization. We don't know if any survivors fled to the mainland or if they all perished in the disaster. But what's really strange is that we don't know where they went. Did the Sardinian people simply vanish off the face of the earth, or did they integrate with other civilizations? Nobody knows the answer. Number 4. The Shardana. The Shardana are another mysterious people who are believed to have come from the sea and attacked Egypt. They're mentioned in the Merneptah stele, which is an ancient Egyptian monument that dates back to 1209 BC. The stele was erected by Pharaoh Merneptah to commemorate his victories over the Libyans, the Canaanites, the Asha, and the Shardana. But who are the Shardana? Nobody knows for sure, but there are some theories. Some scholars believe that the Shardana were actually the sea people. This is based on the fact that the stele mentions the Shardana coming from the sea. Other scholars believe that the Shardana were a local Egyptian tribe that rebelled against Pharaoh Merneptah. But this is unlikely since Merneptah would have mentioned this in the inscription. The truth is, we don't know anything about the Shardana, but we do know that they're an important part of Egyptian history. They were one of the first groups of people to attack Egypt from the sea, and they would not be the last. 3. The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were a group of people who lived along the Mediterranean coast of what is now Lebanon. They were known for their skill in navigation and their ability to build large ships. In fact, the Phoenicians were the first people to use purple dye, which they extracted from a type of sea snail. This made them wealthy, and they were able to build a powerful navy that allowed them to control much of the Mediterranean. But the Phoenician Empire was eventually conquered by the Greeks. Number 2, the Dorian invasion. The Dorians were a mysterious group of people who invaded Greece around 1100 BC. They're believed to have come from the north, and they brought with them a new language and a new culture. The Dorians were responsible for the destruction of many of the Mycenaean palaces, and they ushered Greece into what is known as the Dark Ages. But the Dorians didn't just invade Greece from the north, they also invaded from the sea. This is evidenced by the fact that they brought with them new technologies, including the chariot. The Dorians were also responsible for the introduction of ironworking to Greece. But despite their many accomplishments, the Dorians are shrouded in mystery. We don't know much about their origins or their culture, but we do know that they played a major role in shaping ancient Greece. Number 1, the Sea People. The Sea People are a mysterious group of people who are believed to have invaded Egypt around 1178 BC. They're mentioned in the writings of Pharaoh Ramesses Tsegu, and he describes them as a confederation of peoples who came from the sea. The sea people attacked Egypt repeatedly, but they were eventually defeated by Ramesses II. But the sea people didn't just attack Egypt. They also attacked the Hittites, the Canaanites, and the Assyrians. The sea people were ultimately defeated by the Assyrians, but their origins and their culture are still a mystery. Some scholars believe that the sea people were a group of mercenaries who were hired by the Hittites to fight against Egypt. But this is just a theory. The truth is, we don't know anything about the sea people, but they were clearly a significant force in ancient history. Thanks for watching. Which of these groups would you have liked to have been a part of? Let me know in the comments below. And remember to stay tuned for more videos like these. See you next time. Bye.